dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hello and welcome to another interview episode of TEFLology. This week we bring you an interview with Adrian Holliday. Adrian Holliday is a professor of applied linguistics at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK and is author of several books, including The Struggle to Teach English as an International Language and Intercultural Communication and Ideology. He also acts as Rob's PhD supervisor. Rob met Professor Holliday in Canterbury and asked some questions about the 1994 book Appropriate Methodology and Social Context, and how his views have changed since its publication. During the interview, Professor Holliday uses a few technical terms which may be unfamiliar to some of our listeners. For example, the term tissue rejection, which in this case refers to curriculum projects that are implemented in a foreign country by a Western organisation and are often rejected by the host institution. Professor Holliday also refers to reverse native speakerism at one point, which is a term used by Rob in his PhD dissertation to describe the redefinition of the term native speakerism to mean the discrimination against native speakers, which we discussed with Stephanie Horton in our second interview episode. With those terms cleared up, we hope you enjoy the interview.
Okay, so thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. So could you talk a little about your background, about how you initially became a language teacher and how your interests shifted towards critical issues in ELT?
Okay, right. My first job as an English as a foreign language teacher was in the British Council Centre in Tehran in 1973. And I was locally engaged because I went there under my own steam and got a job when I was there. And what was interesting about that was, at the time, 3/4 of the teachers were Iranian, and there seemed to be no issue about that. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly, after a couple of years, the British Council decided to make their operation more efficient, and they brought in London-engaged senior teachers, and all the people who had been fairly senior were suddenly demoted automatically to a lower scale.
Right.
In other words, there was a higher scale that came in. Mm. And that was the first time that I began to understand that there was some sort of a difference between London-engaged teachers and local teachers, right, especially local teachers who were Iranian. And I was particularly sensitive because there were also many people there who were employed just because they spoke English, right, as they were so-called native speakers. And they were just backpackers. Mm. And I actually got a PGC, I got a teaching diploma for education, and I felt I was a proper professional. Mm-hmm. And so I was very keen that this professionalism would work. But it's interesting that recently, a couple of years ago, I was invited by a research centre in Tehran to advise them. I was very honoured to do this, on how to somehow remove any Western attitude towards the teaching of English.
Right.
And I was in a meeting with them, and it was literally half a mile from the place where I used to work, which of course is no longer there. Mm. And this is a sort of tension that has, this is where it's arrived. But one of my biggest memories of that time in the early 70s was a student, and I've written about this, but a student standing up at the back of my class, much older than me, I don't know how old he was, and being very polite and asking me if I would explain something to him about grammar. Well, this was at the time of audiolingualism,
Right.
and you weren't supposed to explain grammar. And I told him very abruptly that this wasn't the way that you would learn English. And what I meant by that, although I didn't understand it at the time, was that we, with our particular Western background, had our own ideas about how to teach English. And so I can trace this cultural attitude towards the learning of English, which locates the student from another culture as being deficient, right back to that time.
Right.
And so it wasn't because I was a professional, it was because I was a professional who had a particular cultural background. And that's where it all began.
Right. So
It took me a long time to work it out.
So speaking about the cultural backgrounds, in perhaps one of the books that you're best known for, Appropriate Methodology and Social Context, you created this dichotomous way of describing education systems, BANA and TESOL, so British and North America, and tertiary, secondary and primary, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, why did you choose to divide things in that way? And
Well, I no longer hold with that distinction.
Okay.
But this was when I went to work in Syria and then Egypt. Half of that book comes from my PhD thesis.
Right.
The other half comes from my experience of teaching at master's level here. It was very clear when I was working in universities in Syria and Egypt that there was a very different orientation towards language education. So I was very proud of the fact that our teachers at the Language Centre at Damascus University, which is still there, were much better than the British Council teachers.
Right.
And we used to have seminars, joint seminars together, and I thought my teachers, our teachers, because I was involved in employing them, were much more cosmopolitan in their views about language education than the people who were working in a sort of, the British Council isn't really, but a sort of a private sector operation.
Yeah.
And they were much more educated
Right.
about what language teaching was all about. So that's where that distinction arrived from.
Yeah.
And also around the country, and it was very clear that the conditions for teaching, which were considered very normal, were considered rather difficult for those British Council people.
Right.
Because they had this imagination about what a classroom should be like. And quite a long time afterwards, I went to Pakistan to do some work with the SPELT, Society for Pakistani English Language Teaching. And there was a fantastic conference going on. And I remember going to the British Council office, and somebody there said, all these people do is talk about theory. And they had no idea the intellectual depth which those teachers went to engage with their classroom conditions.
Right.
And so you suddenly saw this distinction. Yeah.
And
so, in other words, the state sector people in Pakistan were culturally deficient, and all they can do is talk about theory.
Right. I see. And so you said that you don't hold to that anymore?
No.
Why is that?
Because what that distinction did, it enabled a polarisation to take place. And this idea of context got completely out of hand. Now, Suresh Kanagaraja criticised that book that I wrote because he said that this was a British Western person talking to people like him about how to solve the problems of this other part of the world.
Right.
And I think that's absolutely right.
Okay.
And I didn't see it at the time, but that's how I now see it.
Yeah.
So this banner TCEP polarization has become not problematic.
Mm.
So automatically, anything that's going on, anybody that comes from the TCEP domain has problems.
Right.
And because of the cultural stuff, they're cultural problems.
Mm-hmm.
And context has become particularly problematic as a concept, because what's happening is that as soon as people are invited to talk about my context, they are given the license to oversimplify where they come from.
Right.
And nobody ever discusses the detail of what might be going on in that context at a more complex level.
Mm.
And the reason for that is that my context, TCEP, is nearly always associated with a cultural collectivism.
Mm.
And the implication of that is that everybody's the same.
Right.
So anybody coming from Pakistan will automatically know everything about their context.
Right.
And it's just ridiculously overgeneralized, because everybody in Pakistan is exactly the same.
Right.
You would never ever find, and I challenge anybody who's listening to this, you'd never find a British, American, Australian, New Zealand, whatever teacher talking about their context in the same way, because they're individualists and therefore everything is different.
Right. Right.
So it's a form of othering.
Mm.
So allowing, in master's dissertations, people just describe their context in half a page and nobody interrogates it.
Right.
And that is a process of othering.
Mm. I see. And so perhaps some of the other ideas that you talked about in the book you wrote, which was, I think, more than 20 years ago now, perhaps some of those are related to that, for example, technology transfer. So what did you mean when you wrote about technology transfer, and have your views changed on that?
I was speaking very much from an aid point of view, because up until 91 I'd been working in an aid scenario.
Right.
And it was all about transferring a superior technology to a developing place,
right,
which didn't really have it, which was absolutely ridiculous.
Right.
Because what I began to discover in my PhD work, which was to do with Egyptian university classrooms, but I didn't see the full implication of this, was that there was already a technology, but it wasn't recognised.
Right.
And now I'm connecting this with a critical sociology, people like Stuart Hall, talking about how the West has defined the cultural nature of the rest of the world.
Right, right.
And so whatever happens, I was working in Egypt. Recently, people appeared on television in Tahrir Square carrying out a revolution. People were saying, but they can't do that because Egyptians aren't like that.
Right.
They don't have the technology. And of course, I mean technology in a soft sense.
Right.
I don't mean machines necessarily, but of course mobile phones and everybody texting everybody else.
Yeah.
Because it's been unrecognised.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. And so in terms of ELT projects and curriculums, do you think that leads to what you call tissue rejection?
No, I wouldn't even want to go anywhere near tissue rejection. Okay. Thank God it means tissue rejection.
Right, okay.
There was a fantastic lecture here on Monday evening. Vivian Jabri from University College London, who was saying in this post-colonial era, whenever the aid people arrive, the people who are there already immediately recognise what's going on.
Right.
And whereas the aid people think it's tissue rejection, the people there will see it as as rejecting some form of imperialism.
Right, right.
So on one side, tissue rejection looks as though the innovation isn't working, but on the other side, yeah, people should do whatever they want to do,
right,
and make whatever sense they want to make out of whatever it is that they're receiving, and it's up to them.
Yeah. So do you think that there can be a set of principles guiding the work of professionals from the West going into other contexts in terms of implementing curriculum projects and so on?
Deep moral principles.
Right.
And I guess this has something to do with human rights. And the first one should be that before anything else happens, you begin with the assumption that everybody is supremely intelligent and able to manage their own lives.
Right.
And if they can't, for some reason, it's to do with resources or politics or whatever. And that's where you should begin.
Right. And where do you think people can go from there?
Well, if you begin at that point, then whatever's going on, you have to start working out why things look in the way that they are, given that everybody is supremely intelligent and able to manage their own lives.
I see.
So you've got to work it out.
Right. So there isn't really a strict sort of playbook that you can use?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's enough.
Okay.
That's enough. Treat people as equals.
Right.
Absolute equals.
So would you say that you reject quite a lot of what you wrote at the time of...
I'm very unhappy about the polarisation, but I have brought some things from it, and in my second book in 2005, in this area, I do bring some of the stuff from the first book, and I look at it in a completely different way.
Okay.
And one of the examples that I draw is the Egyptian colleague that I had, who is written about in the first book, and how, given that he was able to acquire resources which enabled him to work less, suddenly he was able to do exactly the same, if not better, than the aid people who were coming in supposedly to show him how to do it.
Right. So do you think there can be any benefit to having an outside set of professionals, for example, aid people or British Council curriculum projects? Do you think there can be any benefit from having that come into another context, another environment?
I think, well, something I do talk about in the first book is a sort of marketplace situation. So, if people somewhere else have a particular set of expertise, you can buy it in and you can use it.
Right.
But you should be in control of what is done with it. It shouldn't be their business.
Right. So if, for example, the British Council were to set up a curriculum project in another country, it would be up to the people in that country or in that context to choose what they did.
I wouldn't ever use the word context ever again.
Okay.
Because it's far too limited.
Right.
Because what's happened is that the aid people go in and try to analyse the context.
Right.
Whereas what they should be doing is thinking, right, okay, how are people going to make use of us? And that's up to them.
Right. I see.
And of course, one of the big issues is that it's very clear to the people who are there already that there's all this money being spent, and most of it's spent on employing people who come from the place that the aid is coming from.
Right. Do you think there can be a conflict between what people in... I don't know what word to use instead of context now. But
Setting.
Okay. So, do you think there's a conflict between what people in this setting...
Perhaps setting will acquire the same limitations as the word context. These are just words. It's what happens to the words that's important.
Yeah.
And context has just become ridiculously simplified. Yeah.
Well, do you think, maybe we'll just use setting for now,
Yeah.
Do you think that there can be a conflict between what people in a particular setting might want and the instructions given to people coming from, for example...
There's bound to be conflict.
Right.
And whose job is it to work out the conflict? The people who bring the product.
Okay.
They've got to work it out. They've got to do some research. They've got to find out what's going on. So it really is a marketplace. What you mustn't do is go around saying, "Oh, they don't know how to use what I brought with me, because what I brought is so superior. You know, why can't they make use of it? And this leads to this idea of cultural deficiency.
Right. Do you think that the marketplace is the kind of marketplace analogy that you've used there?
It's dangerous, though. I'm going to get criticised for this. But
well, I was just going to ask, do you think that the marketplace itself can be neutral?
No.
Or do you think the marketplace is influenced by these same ideas coming from the outside?
Because as my work has developed, taking a postmodern perspective, everything is politically, ideologically motivated. So nothing is ever neutral.
Right.
And technology is never neutral. And so there's always a politics there.
Yeah.
And the politics comes from all sorts of different places. So it's always a political set of activities.
Right. I see. So, so obviously, your views have changed quite a lot since you wrote Appropriate Methodology in Social Context, but that's still quite an influential book.
It is an influential book, and if I really want to go further with this, in my recent work on intercultural communication, in my 2011 book, Intercultural Communication and Ideology, and then the one that comes after that to do with my grammar of culture, I've begun to see different discourses of culture, and one of them, which is, I'm not claiming any originality here, but I'm giving it a name, is a steward discourse.
Right.
And this is a very, very difficult discourse to untangle. So, putting it in very blunt terms, you've got somebody in a university, perhaps like this one, I'm not accusing anybody, but perhaps like this one, and you get a student coming to do a master's program or some other program from outside the West, and everybody is extremely well-wishing, people are decent, seriously, genuinely sincere in wanting to do the best they can for their students. But unfortunately, and I take this from a critical cosmopolitan sociology, which starts, although he wouldn't call it that, with Stuart Hall, and it is going, so there's a whole lot written about this. In order to be helpful to non-Western people, because there is a profound feeling of a difference between individualism and collectivism, which is supposed to be neutral, but now people are seeing individualism as being positive and collectivism as being negative, because it's a description of deficiency.
Right.
Then, in order to be helpful to your non-Western students, you give them the space to write about their context.
And their setting.
No, their context. It's called their context.
Right.
And they will then write about their context. And the politics is under the surface for both parties. But what's actually going on is that the Western academic is inviting the non-Western student to other themselves.
Right.
By entering into a discourse of simplicity. And this is so there's a stewardship. And this is very, very hard to get to the bottom of. But this ends up in a profound cultural inequality.
Yeah. Is this perhaps kind of similar to, in my teaching context in Japan, my teaching setting in Japan, when some of my colleagues, I hear them say to students, now we're going to have a long speaking activity. You guys are Japanese, I know that you don't like speaking very much, it's very difficult for you. And then the students struggle with the activity. Do you think that's kind of a similar thing, a self-fulfilling prophecy?
I think it may well be, because first of all there's this concept of difficulty. But I can't believe that there isn't some ideology and politics underneath that concept.
Right.
Yeah. There's something going on there between the lines.
Right, okay.
And that's why I'm a little bit cautious about this idea of reverse native speakerism.
Right.
I think there's another politics going on deep between the lines.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that in a
Yeah.
different setting. So perhaps the majority of our listeners are regular teachers. What advice would you give to regular teachers who are entering a different educational setting for the first time? So not as planners or curriculum developers.
Exactly the same. Begin with the principle that students and colleagues are supremely intelligent and supremely capable of whatever it is that they want to do.
Right.
And start with that. And if you get away from that, then there's a serious human rights issue.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll end it there.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to today's interview episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you'd like to get in contact, you can email us at teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. We'll return again with a regular episode soon.